This is how hygiene was on pirate ships, and honestly, it's wilder than you think. Alright, let me paint you a picture. You're standing on the deck of a wooden ship somewhere in the Caribbean, around the year 1700. The sun is blazing down on you, the salt air hits you in the face, and everywhere around you, tarred rope, fish guts, wet wood, unwashed men, dozens of them, and every single one of them has been out here for weeks. No shower, no toothbrush, no deodorant, just life. Raw, unfiltered, full-on pirate life. Now, does that make your stomach turn a little? Because it should. But here's the thing. It's also way more fascinating than disgusting once you actually dig into it. Because pirates, believe it or not, had their own kind of system. It wasn't pretty, but it worked, at least well enough to keep them sailing. So buckle up, because today we're going deep into the world of pirate hygiene between 1680 and 1730, one of the most legendary eras in the history of the high seas. Let's start with the obvious. If you had somehow teleported onto a pirate ship in the golden age of piracy, the first thing that would have knocked you flat wasn't the crew. It was the smell. Below deck, where most of the men slept, the stench was something else entirely. You had bilge water. That's the dark, stagnant water that collects at the very bottom of the ship, fermenting in the heat, mixing with rotting food, animal waste, old sweat, and whatever else found its way down there. Old sailors used to say that the smell of a ship could tell you everything about the health of her crew. And on most pirate vessels, that smell would have told you, these boys are rough. But here's what most people don't realize, and what really gets me every time. The men living in that environment didn't just roll over and accept filth. They adapted. They had to. Because if disease ran through a pirate ship unchecked, it could wipe out an entire crew faster than any naval cannon ever could. So how did pirates actually clean themselves? Well, the short answer is seawater and rain, whenever they could get it. Fresh water was absolutely precious on a ship. It was rationed strictly, used for drinking and cooking, not for washing. A sailor who used drinking water to clean himself would have been in serious trouble with the crew. That's just not how it worked. But seawater, that was free and everywhere. Pirates would strip down and pour buckets of seawater over themselves, especially in the tropics, where the heat made not bathing pretty unbearable. Now, seawater doesn't lather like soap, and it leaves a salt residue on the skin that can actually cause irritation over time. But it was better than nothing. Way better. Rain was considered a golden opportunity. When a good tropical rainstorm hit, men would strip down completely and stand out in it, washing their bodies, sometimes their clothes. You ever heard the saying, any port in a storm? For pirates, a rainstorm was basically a luxury spa day. No joke. And what about soap? Soap did exist in this era, but it was expensive and not always available on pirate ships. When they had it, it was typically made from animal fat and ash. Rough stuff, nothing like what you'd use today. But it worked well enough to scrub the worst of the grime off. Think of it as the hand sanitizer of the 1700s. You used it when you had it and made do when you didn't. Okay, this is where things get a little rough. Let's talk teeth. Dental care in the golden age of piracy was, well, it was basically non-existent in any form we'd recognize today. There were no toothbrushes as we know them, at least not widely available. Some sailors used what were called chew sticks, which were small twigs from certain trees with natural antibacterial properties. You'd chew the end until it frayed and then rub it against your teeth. It sounds primitive, but honestly, it wasn't totally ineffective. Certain wood types, like neem or licorice root, actually do have properties that help fight bacteria in the mouth. Does that blow your mind a little? It should. Rinsing the mouth with water or vinegar was also common. Vinegar in particular was used as a basic antimicrobial. Pirates didn't know the science behind it, but they knew from experience that it kept things fresher longer. They were doing functional dentistry without knowing it. The big enemy of pirate teeth? Diet. The lack of fresh fruit and vegetables, particularly on long voyages, led to scurvy, a disease caused by vitamin C deficiency. And one of scurvy's nastiest effects was on the gums. They'd swell, bleed, and eventually cause teeth to loosen and fall out. So a lot of veteran pirates you'd meet around 1700 were working with significantly fewer teeth than they started with. That's just the reality of the sea. Here's a fun question for you, and I mean that sarcastically. What do you think was the most common creature on a pirate ship besides the pirates themselves? Rats. And lice. Absolutely everywhere. Rats lived in the cargo hold, gnawing through food stores, spreading disease, and generally being a menace. A ship's cat, if they were lucky enough to have one, was one of the most valued crew members aboard for exactly this reason. Cats were the pest control department, the exterminator, the MVP of below-deck living. They were treated well, fed, and respected. Because a ship without a cat was a ship losing its food supply to rodents. Lice were a completely different problem, and a much more personal one. Head lice and body lice were almost universal among sailors of this era. It wasn't a sign of being particularly dirty, it was just life at sea. The close quarters, the shared hammocks, the impossibility of washing clothing or bedding regularly, all of it created perfect conditions for lice to thrive. The way pirates dealt with lice, and this part is kind of fascinating, was through mutual grooming. Crewmates would pick lice off each other, similar to how primates do. It sounds gross by modern standards, but it was a practical social behavior that also helped build bonds among the crew. You know how they say, "You scratch my back and I'll scratch yours"? Well, on a pirate ship that was pretty literal. Some men would shave their heads entirely to reduce the problem. Others used combs made of bone or wood to work through their hair. Clothing would be boiled when possible, though on a ship with limited fresh water and fuel, when possible, wasn't always very often. All right, we need to talk about the bathroom situation. Because yes, pirates had a designated spot for this, and it's actually the origin of a word you use all the time without thinking about it. On a sailing ship, the toilet area was called the head. And the reason is exactly what you think. It was located at the head or front of the ship, on the bowsprit platform. Why there? Because the wind almost always came from behind a sailing ship, and placing the latrine at the front meant that the wind naturally carried the smell away from the crew. Genius, honestly. The design was simple, wooden planks with holes cut out over the open sea. No walls, no privacy. You did your business, and the ocean took care of the rest. Splash from the waves below actually helped with basic cleaning, unpleasant as that sounds. Now toilet paper? Absolutely not. What sailors used was called a tow rag, a piece of rope soaked in seawater that was tied to the railing near the head. Everyone used the same rope. You'd use it and then dip it back into the sea to clean it off for the next person. I know what you're thinking. And yes, it was exactly as bad as it sounds. But in the context of a wooden ship in the middle of the ocean in 1700, it was also completely normal. People adapt to their circumstances. They always have. That's one of the most human things about all of this. Here's something that doesn't get brought up enough when people talk about pirate hygiene. The food situation was deeply tied to health and cleanliness. The diet on a pirate ship during the Golden Age was rough. Hardtack, thick, dry biscuits made of flour and water, was a staple. It lasted a long time, which was the whole point, but it also became infested with weevils over time. Sailors would tap the hardtack on the table to knock the bugs out before eating. Or, if they were really hungry and not feeling picky that day, they'd just eat it in the dark so they couldn't see what was in it. Out of sight, out of mind. You know what they say. Salted meat was another staple, preserved in barrels of brine to survive long voyages without refrigeration. It was functional food, caloric, long-lasting, and absolutely terrible by any other standard. After weeks at sea, the salt meat could be so tough and pungent that it had to be soaked in water for hours before eating. Fresh food, fruit, vegetables, fresh meat, was a massive treat whenever pirates made port or captured a merchant vessel. A ship full of fresh produce was almost as valuable as gold to men who'd been at sea for months, because they knew what the absence of it did to their bodies. The pirate diet directly affected their hygiene and health in ways that are hard to overstate. Weak, sick men can't sail, can't fight, and can't keep the ship clean. So food was never just about comfort, it was about survival and functionality. Now here's something that might genuinely catch you off guard. And I love this part of the story. Pirates were, in some ways, surprisingly organized about hygiene and ship maintenance. Not out of cleanliness obsession, but out of pure survival logic. Many pirate ships operated under what were called articles, written codes of conduct that every crew member signed before joining. These weren't just about how to divide treasure or handle disputes. They also covered things like keeping the ship in order, maintaining weapons, and not bringing behaviors aboard that would endanger the crew. There were often specific rules about where you could and couldn't relieve yourself. Breaking those rules and using somewhere other than the designated head could get you in serious trouble with the quartermaster. Same with keeping your hammock space reasonably clean, not storing rotting food near sleeping areas, and keeping gunpowder away from open flames. Does that change how you picture pirates a little? Because it should. The Hollywood image of total, glorious chaos was real in some ways, but underneath the chaos was a functional society with rules, hierarchy, and logic. The ship had to work, and for the ship to work, the men had to stay alive. And for the men to stay alive, certain standards had to be maintained. Simple as that. Let's talk grooming for a second, because it's more interesting than you might expect. Hair was a real practical issue on a ship. Long, loose hair tangled in rigging. And getting tangled in rigging could cost you fingers or worse. Many pirates wore their hair tied back or braided for this reason. The iconic image of the wild-haired pirate is partly real, but many experienced sailors were actually quite deliberate about managing their hair for safety reasons. Beards were common. Shaving required a sharp razor, steady hands, and ideally calm water, which wasn't exactly a standard condition at sea. Some pirates kept their beards neatly trimmed, others let them grow wild. The famous Blackbeard, Edward Teach, reportedly tied his massive black beard into braids and tucked them behind his ears to keep them out of his face. Whether or not that's entirely true, it gives you a sense of how pirates actually thought about their appearance in functional terms. Fingernails and toenails were kept short for practical reasons. Long nails caught on rope and canvas, and an infected nail injury on a ship with no medical supplies was genuinely dangerous. Nails were trimmed with knives, which is exactly as improvised as it sounds. Alright, let's talk about what happened when the hygiene failed. Because it did. Regularly. The most common diseases on pirate ships were dysentery, typhus, and scurvy. Dysentery was often caused by contaminated water, a reminder of just how critical it was to maintain the water barrels properly and not let them sit too long. Typhus spread through lice, which, as we already talked about, were impossible to fully eliminate. And scurvy attacked the bodies of any man who went too long without fresh fruit or vegetables. The ship's surgeon, if the ship was large enough to have one, was one of the most respected figures on board, not because of any glamour in the job, but because everyone knew their life could depend on that person at any moment. Surgical tools were basic. Anesthesia didn't exist as we know it. Rum was used both as a disinfectant and as something of a painkiller, by making the patient drunk enough not to fully register what was happening. Can you imagine? Because I can't. The toughness required to live that life is genuinely hard to wrap your head around from where we're sitting right now. One thing surgeons and experienced sailors did understand, even without germ theory, was that fresh air, sunlight, and cleanliness below deck reduced sickness. They didn't know why, but they'd observed it enough times to know it was true. Ships would air out the lower decks by opening every hatch possible on clear days, and vinegar was sometimes used to wash down surfaces because it was known to reduce rot and smell. Practical wisdom passed down through generations of seafarers. I want to come back to this for a second, because it's something people are genuinely curious about, and nobody ever quite answers it directly. What did pirates actually smell like? Honestly? Tar, salt, smoke, sweat, fish. And underneath all of that, the permanent damp wood smell of the ship itself. Tar was used everywhere on a wooden ship, to waterproof the hull, to seal the rigging, to protect the wood from the constant assault of seawater. It got on hands, clothes, skin. After a while, it just became part of the smell of a sailor. Salt dries into the skin and clothes and stays there. Smoke from the ship's cook stove would drift through the whole vessel, and the mix of all of it together, overlaid on men who hadn't had a proper wash in weeks, created a very specific, very intense smell that we genuinely have no modern equivalent for. Here's the wild part though, and this is something worth sitting with. The men on those ships didn't notice it. You don't notice what you're surrounded by all the time. Their noses had completely adjusted to their environment. They would have walked into a clean, modern building and found it bizarre, sterile, almost antiseptic. The smells we take for granted as clean, soap, shampoo, laundry detergent, would have been completely foreign to them. Perspective is everything, isn't it? By the 1730s, the golden age of piracy was winding down. Naval powers, particularly Britain and Spain, had gotten serious about hunting pirates down and clearing them from trade routes. The era of Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, and Calico Jack was coming to a close. But the legacy of how those men lived, including how they managed, or failed to manage their hygiene, tells us something really important about human adaptability. These were men living in genuinely extreme conditions. Constant danger, Unpredictable food and water, disease, heat, violent weather, cramped quarters. And they built systems, imperfect, rough around the edges, sometimes disgusting by modern standards, that allowed them to function, to survive, and to keep their ships running. They didn't have what we have, not even close, but they used what they had. They passed knowledge down through experience, and they kept going. That's a very human story, when you think about it. So, what do you think? Does all of this change how you see pirates? Because here's the thing about the golden age of piracy that I keep coming back to. It's easy to romanticize it. The freedom, the adventure, the open ocean. And there was real romance in it, in a rough and dangerous way. But there was also tar under the fingernails, lice in the hair, hardtack with weevils in it, and a tow rag by the bow. The real pirates weren't the swashbuckling heroes of the movies. They were working people, hardened, practical, resourceful, making do with the raw materials of their world. And honestly, that makes them more interesting to me, not less. If you made it this far, you already know more about pirate hygiene than 99% of people walking around out there. And that's something. Drop a comment.